Murder trials underway in Cole County for a man accused of killing Angela and Rodney Gilpin.
That Mr. Hosier ever possessed this gun.
Police say it was Hosier, her neighbor, waiting for her as she left her apartment for work.
Hosier also added how much he missed the Gilpins. The next course of action for Hosier's legal team would be to appeal the ruling.
Family and police say their reconciliation may have been motive for the murder.
Her sister covered her face and cried. Some of Angela Gilpin's family cried as well, while others just stared straight ahead.
Background. In 2009, Hosier had an affair with Angela Gilpin, who was married to her husband, Rodney. The affair ended in August 2009, and the victim reconciled with her husband. In September 2009, Hosier broke into the victim's apartment and slayed them. Her purse contained an application for a protective order against Hosier, service information indicating she knew Hosier had a prior criminal record and possessed several arms, and a third document stating she was afraid Hosier might shoot her and her husband. Hosier fled to Oklahoma, where he was taken into custody by local law enforcement. Police recovered 15 arms, ammunition, a bulletproof vest, a crowbar, latex gloves, a homemade police baton, and a knife from his vehicle. All arms were loaded except for a Sten submash gun, which was determined to be the slaying weapon. Upon his arrest, Hosier repeatedly threatened or ended the situation. In one of the inculpatory messages, Hosier threatened the victim and stated, "I'm gonna finish it."
That Mr. Hosier ever possessed this gun.
Hosier would have known when Angie normally left. The two had reportedly had a relationship while Angie was estranged from her husband.
The death penalty for Hosier because the prosecution proved aggravated circumstances, meaning that it was a more serious crime.
Her sister covered her face and cried. Some of Angela Gilpin's family cried as well, while others just stared straight ahead.
Hosier was indicted in the Cole County Circuit Court, found guilty of slaying in the first degree, armed criminal action, burglary in the first degree, and unlawful possession of an arm by a felon. The state presented evidence of two statutory aggravating circumstances. 1. Hosier had a serious assaultive conviction, and 2. The slaying was committed while Hosier engaged in another unlawful homicide, i.e. slaying the victim's husband. The jury unanimously found the existence of both statutory aggravating circumstances and unanimously recommended the ending penalty. The court sentenced Hosier to ending for slaying and imposed 2 15-year sentences and a 7-year sentence for the armed criminal action, burglary, and unlawful possession charges. Analysis of the case. The court reviews a post-conviction relief motion to determine if the motion court's findings of fact and conclusions of law are clearly erroneous. In this case, Hosier asserts 8 points of error related to his claims that both trial and appellate counsel were ineffective. To be entitled to post-conviction relief on a claim of ineffective assistance of counsel, a movant must show by a preponderance of the evidence that 1. His trial counsel failed to exercise the level of skill and diligence that a reasonably competent trial counsel would in a similar situation, and 2. He was prejudiced by that failure. If either requirement is not met, a claim of ineffective assistance of counsel must fail. To overcome the strong presumption that trial counsel's conduct was reasonable and effective, a movant must identify specific acts or omissions of counsel that fell outside the wide range of professional competent assistance.
Police say it was Hosier, her neighbor, waiting for her as she left her apartment for work.
Angela Gilpin in her Jefferson City apartment in 2009. The Gilpins lived on the same street as Hosier.
The jury has heard that Hosier was found after a police chase in Oklahoma when he crossed a roadblock. 15 years each for the charges of burglary in the first degree and armed criminal action, and 7 for unlawful possession of firearm.
Reasonable choices of trial strategy, no matter how ill-fated they appear in hindsight, cannot serve as a basis for a claim of ineffective assistance. Hosier asserts 3 points of error relating to his conviction on the charge of unlawful possession of an arm by a felon. This charge was predicated on Hosier's 1993 felony conviction in Indiana for battery. There, Hosier's former girlfriend, Nancy Marshall, had asked Hosier to move out of her house and had obtained an order of protection against him. Hosier grabbed Marshall, took her to the basement, handcuffed her, and beat her until she lost consciousness. Hosier was charged with and pleaded guilty to the felony of battery and sentenced to 8 years imprisonment. Hosier argues that trial counsel was ineffective for failing to stipulate to the prior felony conviction which would have prevented the jury from hearing the name and surrounding circumstances of the conviction underlying the felon in possession charge during the guilt phase of the trial. The state was willing to stipulate to the 1993 Indiana felony, but defense counsel declined to do so. As a result, the state was allowed to introduce documents showing both the facts of the 1993 conviction and the circumstances surrounding that conviction. Hosier argues this evidence was highly prejudicial because the facts underlying that conviction involved a criminal attack of a former romantic partner, and Hosier was on trial for slaying another former romantic partner. At trial, Hosier was represented by counsel Don Catlett and counsel Janice Zembles. Counsel Zembles testified that although the prosecutor was willing to stipulate to the prior felony conviction, she did not enter into a stipulation because she did not want the jury to be surprised about the facts of the 1993 conviction when it inevitably learned of them during the penalty phase.
Murder trials underway in Cole County for a man accused of killing Angela and Rodney Gilpin.
Today, Cole County Judge Pat Joyce sided with the jury and gave Hosier the death penalty.
Angie's mother says her daughter and her husband were getting back together, which is why he was at her apartment.
Hosier also added how much he missed the Gilpins. The next course of action for Hosier's legal team would be to appeal the ruling.
She believed Marshall would testify at the penalty phase because her name was on the witness list and was in a position to offer relevant and admissible evidence concerning the 1993 conviction. The motion court found defense counsel's decision not to stipulate to the fact of the 1993 Indiana conviction in the guilt phase to preclude angering the jury in the penalty phase when it inevitably learned of the circumstances surrounding that conviction was a reasonable trial strategy. However, Old Chief held that a trial court abuses its discretion by not accepting a defendant's offer to stipulate to the fact of a prior conviction when the name and nature of the conviction raises the risk of unfair prejudice. Even if Hosier had been able to show that defense counsel's performance was constitutionally defective for failing to stipulate to the 1993 Indiana felony, his ineffective assistance claim would fail because Hosier failed to show any prejudice. The court is not convinced that the jury made an improper use of evidence concerning the 1993 conviction, i.e. propensity, rather than a proper use of that evidence. Instead, the trial record shows the jury's guilty verdict was supported by a wide range of inculpatory evidence, including Hosier's past relationship with the victim's fear of Hosier, Hosier's flight shortly after the slayings, and the arsenal of weapons found in his possession at the time of arrest. Ineffectiveness of trial counsel. Hosier argues that trial counsel was ineffective for failing to make a proper motion to sever the unlawful possession of an arm by a felon count prior to trial. The trial court overruled the oral motion to sever, and Hosier did not show that the counsel's failure to do so undermined the court's confidence in the outcome of the guilt phase. In his direct appeal, the court rejected Hosier's argument that it was an error to admit all of the weapons evidence. The court found that all of the weapons and ammunition were properly admitted to prove the slaying charge because evidence of Hosier's flight from Oklahoma to Missouri, including the circumstances surrounding his arrest in Oklahoma, was relevant to show consciousness of guilt on that slaying charge. Hosier concedes trial counsel failed to preserve for appeal the trial court's failure to sever the felon in possession charge. He claims that appellate counsel was ineffective for failing to raise the denial of severance as a plain error claim. The motion court found that Hosier wholly failed to show any prejudice from his appellate counsel's decision not to seek plain error review of the trial court's denial of defense counsel's oral motion to sever.
I'm not sure if my defense was adequate or not. Like I said, I'm sitting here accused.
David Hosier showed no visible reaction when the judge read the jury's recommendation that he be sentenced to death.
Of a murder, I'm found guilty of a murder that I did not commit.
Authorities found the two shot in Angela's apartment building on September 28, 2009.
I buried my daughter because of this man's deed. No parent should ever have to do that.
Hosier claims that defense counsel were ineffective for introducing medical records regarding his mental health history into evidence in the penalty phase without calling an expert witness to interpret those records for the jury. The motion court found that there was no reason to believe that calling an expert would have resulted in a viable defense otherwise unavailable to Hosier. Hosier also claims that defense counsel were ineffective for failing to object to certain victim impact testimony, such as Dakota Gilpin's testimony regarding the impact of Hosier's crime. Counsel was not ineffective for failing to object under these circumstances, and the trial court did not err in denying this claim. Judicial disqualification. Hosier, a man who was convicted of a crime, sought to disqualify Judge Joyce from presiding over his post-conviction proceeding. Judge Gary Oxenhandler was appointed to hear the motion and rule on it. Hosier based both his motion to disqualify Judge Joyce from presiding over his post-conviction proceeding and his claim that she should have rescued herself sua sponte in his criminal case on the same facts. Judge Oxenhandler held an evidentiary hearing and found that Judge Joyce had no memory of having any contact with Hosier's ex-wife during a child support enforcement case. Ultimately, Judge Oxenhandler overruled the motion to disqualify Judge Joyce because her representation in the case would have no impact on her ability to preside over Hosier's post-conviction proceeding. Hosier now claims that Judge Joyce erred by not recusing herself sua sponte in his criminal case for the first time in his Rule 29.15 motion.
The judge also sentenced Hosier to a total of 37 years for his other convictions.
Who is a neighbor of Angela's and has a brief relationship with her prior to her getting back together with her husband, Rodney.
Angie had a lot of life to be with her family, and it was taken away.
Family and police say their reconciliation may have been motive for the murder.
Dr. Bruce Harry testified that a transient ischemic attack is a temporary decrease in blood flow and loss of oxygen and glucose to part of the brain, with symptoms resembling those of a stroke. The court will review Hosier's claims as asserting the former argument, as the gravamen of these points suggest it is the former. Defense counsel did not reassert their closing argument objection in the motion for new trial, and Hosier does not claim their failure to do so constitutes ineffective assistance of counsel. Even if Hosier had asserted an ineffective assistance of counsel claim based on defense counsel's failure to move to disqualify Judge Joyce in his criminal case, that claim would have failed because such a motion would have been meritless. Hosier is scheduled to end by injection at 6 p.m. June 11 at the state prison in Bonne Terre, Missouri. That's all for this video, folks. See you next time.